Hello, my name's Helen Russell and I'm a researcher at the Economic and Social Research Institute. I'm going to present some key findings on gender and paid work in Ireland to help inform your discussions on the topic. I'm going to talk about 5 different areas of employment. Firstly, the employment gap. Secondly, gender segregation. Thirdly, hours of work. Fourthly, security. And finally, the earnings gap. So, how do men and women's rates of employment compare? This graph shows the employment rates of men and women from the mid-1990s to the present. At the start of the period, we can see that there was a wide gap between men and women. Just 50% of women aged 25 to 54 years were employed compared to over 80% of men. We can see that this gap declined over the 1990s and early 2000s as there was a very steep increase in women's employment. We then see this decline during the recession period when the gap between men and women narrowed, mainly because men were more likely to lose jobs during that period. Since then, the gap has widened out a little again and then has stayed fairly stable. So what types of jobs are men and women doing? If we look at the top occupation here, which are managers and directors, we see that women make up 35% of this group, which is much lower than their overall share of employment, which is 46%. Women are overrepresented in the professional group, the administrative and secretarial group, and in the caring, leisure and other services group, where they make up 79% of those employed in those areas. Women are underrepresented in skilled trades and manufacturing jobs. There has been a decline in segregation over the last 30 years, but these figures show that many occupations are still dominated by women or men. If we look at even more detailed categories, we can see an even higher level of segregation. So, for example, if we look at the top group here, which is vehicle mechanics and electricians, you see that almost 99% of that group are men. While at the other end of the scale here, we see that primary and preschool teaching professions are overwhelmingly female. So moving on to consider some aspects of working conditions. So we look first here at job insecurity. Overall, 10% of female employees and 8% of male employees are on temporary contracts. This proportion is even higher if we look at new entrants to the labour market. So young people and migrants are particularly likely to be on temporary contracts. So amongst new entrants, 28% of women and 25% of men were on temporary contracts. But actually not all permanent jobs are secure. So we also look at subjective insecurity. So this is the proportion of workers who think that it's likely they will lose their job in the next 6 months. And here we see there's a higher proportion of workers who are insecure in this measure, but also that there's not really any difference between men and women on that measure. Another important aspect of working conditions is the hours of work, and this is particularly important for pay. This graph shows that women are more likely to be working part-time hours, so less than 30 hours per week, than men, and at the other end of the scale that men are much more likely to be working longer hours. So we see here that 53% of men are working 40 hours or more in paid work per week. compared to 25% of women. So turning to pay, we find that on average, men earn €847 per week and women earn €635 per week. So this means that women on average are earning 25% less than men per week. So we call that the gender pay gap. So weekly earnings like this are really important for standard of living. This gender gap is partly due to differences in hours that I showed you previously. But the gap persists even if we look at hourly pay. So if we look at wages per hour, the gap goes down from 25% to 14%, which is nevertheless very significant. And we also see that this has stalled really since 2014. So over the whole period here, the gap is about 14%. A gender pay gap of this size puts women in the middle of the table for the EU, lower than the EU 28 average, which is 16%. These figures here are the raw gaps across countries, so they don't take into account differences, for example, in the education of men and women in different countries, or the age profile, or fertility, or anything like that. So the gap in average earnings is important, but it's also important to know what's happening at the bottom of the wage scale. So it's important to look at low pay. We look at this in two different ways. So first of all, using the European definition, which is those earning less than 2/3 of average hourly pay. And we can see that on this measure, women are more likely to fall below that threshold. We also look at a second measure, which is the living wage, which is the amount of earnings needed to purchase goods and services necessary for a minimum essential standard of living. So things like housing, transport, food, etc. And this was calculated to be €11.90 in 2018, which these figures refer to. And we see that again, women are more likely to fall below this threshold. So 23% of male workers and 27% of female workers fall into this category. We find the same pattern if we look at the composition of people who are on the national minimum wage. Women are more likely to be receiving that wage. A range of explanations have been put forward to account for the gender pay gap, and I will just summarise these here. They can be grouped into individual level explanations and organisational or structural explanations. Individual explanations focus on the behaviour, characteristics and preferences of workers themselves. So, for example, differences in the educational qualifications of men and women, or differences in work experience. So we know that women are more likely to take time out of employment to care for children, and this can feed into the gender pay gap. Another factor here is differences in preferences. So some people argue that women trade off pay against greater flexibility or other work characteristics, and that men and women have different work values. On the other side, we have organisational or structural explanations. These focus on the actions of employers and organisations and on the role of public policy in shaping the options open to women and men and the opportunities. So this encompasses discrimination, for example, in recruitment, promotion, and access to other opportunities. Discrimination may be overt or more subtle and unconscious. Other research focuses on the role of occupational segregation and the devaluation of female-type jobs, such as caring occupations. Other research highlights the glass ceiling and sticky floors and the barriers to advancement, both formal and informal, that may operate and prevent women from reaching higher level occupations. Finally, we must consider the role of policies and institutions. This includes policies at the organisation level, such as access to flexible work arrangements, and also state policies, such as the provision of childcare, the tax and benefit system, and also employment regulation and the system of industrial relations more generally, which shapes the extent of wage inequality across the economy. The role these factors play in the pay gap will influence which solutions are likely to be effective. Other presentations will discuss these different influences and the potential solutions available. Thanks for listening.